On a cross-country flight, Daniel approached Mrs. Peterson, an elderly veteran seated by the window, and rudely demanded that she move, claiming the seat was his. His authoritative tone caught the attention of nearby passengers, who were shocked by his behavior, especially given Mrs. Peterson's dignified presence. When she calmly asked why she should move, Daniel impatiently insisted that he needed the seat more than she did, exuding a sense of entitlement that made everyone uncomfortable. But before we dive into the story, make sure to smash that like button, hit subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our exciting stories. Mrs. Peterson, maintaining her composure, slowly stood up with the aid of her cane and made her way down the aisle, looking for another seat. The passengers silently observed, showing no support for Daniel's behavior. A sympathetic flight attendant quickly found Mrs. Peterson a new seat, providing her with extra care by adjusting her recline and offering a blanket and water. The other passengers murmured in disapproval, with some openly expressing their frustration at Daniel's lack of respect. Despite the growing discontent around him, Daniel remained unapologetic. He settled into Mrs. Peterson's former seat, stretching out and acting as though he was fully justified. His arrogance only grew as he ignored the disapproving looks from others. Meanwhile, in her new seat, Mrs. Peterson engaged in a warm conversation with her seatmate, sharing stories about her time in the Navy. This conversation helped lighten the mood and allowed her to focus on something positive. As the flight continued, Daniel overheard Mrs. Peterson's conversation but remained indifferent, even rolling his eyes at the veteran's stories. By the time the plane landed, Daniel was eager to disembark and hurriedly pushed past others, maintaining his rude and entitled demeanor. After most passengers had exited, a kind man helped Mrs. Peterson gather her belongings, treating her with the respect she deserved. Several passengers thanked her for her service as she made her way off the plane. Once at the airport terminal, Mrs. Peterson was greeted by her granddaughter, Lauren. As they headed home, Mrs. Peterson recounted the incident to Lauren, who was shocked and outraged by Daniel's behavior. Lauren expressed her anger and determination to make sure someone heard about the disrespect her grandmother had faced. Mrs. Peterson, however, sought peace in her familiar surroundings and took comfort in revisiting her military memorabilia, finding solace in the memories of her service. That evening, Mrs. Peterson decided to write a letter to the airline, detailing the incident and Daniel's behavior. She described how he had demanded her seat and treated her dismissively, despite her being a veteran. In her letter, she emphasized the importance of respect for elders and veterans, hoping that her complaint would bring attention to the matter. The airline responded promptly, extending a heartfelt apology and assuring her that they would investigate the situation. While the airline's response provided some comfort, Mrs. Peterson couldn't shake the feeling that more needed to be done. Reporting the incident wasn't enough to ensure that veterans like her would receive the respect they deserved. Determined to take action, she reached out to her local veteran community. She shared the story of the encounter, hoping her fellow service members would stand with her in raising awareness about the issue. The response from the veteran community was overwhelmingly supportive. Many expressed their outrage at Daniel's treatment of Mrs. Peterson, and several shared similar stories of disrespect they had faced. Together, they vowed to raise awareness and advocate for the respectful treatment of veterans. One community leader, Hank, a former Marine, suggested that they identify Daniel and spread the word about his behavior, ensuring that others in the veteran community would be aware of him. Mrs. Peterson agreed to the plan and, with the help of the veteran community, began gathering testimonies from fellow passengers who had witnessed the incident. Many were eager to contribute, providing detailed accounts of Daniel's behavior. As the testimonies came in, Mrs. Peterson and her team pieced together more information about Daniel, even discovering that he was a frequent traveler who often flaunted his elite status. This further motivated the veterans to take action and spread awareness about his disrespectful conduct. With a growing network of support, Mrs. Peterson contacted veteran communities in Daniel's area. She informed them of the incident and shared the information she had gathered. The veteran groups were appalled by what they learned and readily agreed to keep an eye out for Daniel, warning others about his behavior. Soon, the story spread beyond the local community, gaining traction within national veteran networks as well. As news of Daniel's behavior spread within veteran communities, local organizations posted warnings on their social media platforms and newsletters, emphasizing the importance of respect and urging vigilance. The story of Mrs. Peterson's encounter resonated with many, sparking a larger conversation about the treatment of veterans. Support poured in from veterans across the country, each expressing their solidarity with Mrs. Peterson and sharing their own experiences of disrespect. With the support of the veteran community, Mrs. Peterson felt empowered. The collective effort reassured her that this wasn't just about her experience, it was about ensuring that veterans everywhere were treated with the dignity they deserved. The unity within the community strengthened as they stood together in their mission to promote respect. Meanwhile, news outlets began picking up on Mrs. Peterson's story. The tale of the elderly veteran being ordered out of her seat by an entitled passenger caught the public's interest. Local news stations featured the story, and soon it reached national audiences. A journalist named Sarah contacted Mrs. Peterson, eager to interview her for a segment. Mrs. Peterson agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to raise awareness on a broader scale. In the interview, Mrs. Peterson calmly recounted the incident, using it as a teachable moment to emphasize the importance of respect for veterans. Her message resonated deeply with viewers, and the story quickly gained widespread attention. Social media platforms were flooded with messages of support for Mrs. Peterson, and hashtags honoring veterans and criticizing Daniel's behavior began to trend. The story struck a chord with the public, sparking a national conversation about how society should treat its veterans. As the media coverage expanded, Daniel began to feel the weight of his actions. The story of his behavior on the flight was everywhere. He couldn't escape the news, and the public scrutiny became overwhelming. Strangers recognized him, approached him, and condemned his actions. His social media accounts were flooded with critical comments, and even his friends and colleagues expressed their disappointment in him. The realization of the harm he had caused began to sink in, and Daniel was left grappling with the consequences of his actions. Faced with the overwhelming backlash, Daniel began to realize the full impact of his behavior. The constant public criticism and the disappointment expressed by his friends and colleagues weighed heavily on him. Determined to make amends, he decided to issue a public apology. He carefully crafted a sincere message, admitting to his wrongdoings and apologizing to Mrs. Peterson and all veterans. In his apology, Daniel acknowledged the importance of respect and vowed to change his ways. When Daniel posted his apology on social media, the response was mixed. Some people accepted his apology, believing in the possibility of redemption and second chances. They appreciated that he was taking responsibility for his actions and attempting to make things right. However, others remained skeptical, feeling that words alone were not enough to undo the damage. Many believed that Daniel's actions required more than just an apology to truly make amends. Mrs. Peterson saw Daniel's apology but chose not to respond immediately. Instead, she focused on her ongoing efforts to raise awareness about the respectful treatment of veterans. For her, the incident had become part of a larger mission to ensure that all veterans were treated with dignity. She continued to work with veteran organizations, participated in community events, and gave talks at local schools. Her message remained clear: veterans deserve respect and gratitude for their service, and society as a whole needed to do better. In the meantime, the veteran community, inspired by Mrs. Peterson's dedication, organized a special event to honor her contributions. The event was a way to celebrate not only her service as a veteran, but also her efforts to promote respect for all who had served. Invitations were sent out to veterans and supporters, and the gathering quickly became a significant talking point in the community. At the event, Mrs. Peterson delivered a heartfelt speech recounting the incident with Daniel as a lesson in mutual respect. She emphasized that everyone, especially veterans, deserved to be treated with dignity. Her speech resonated deeply with the attendees, many of whom stood up and pledged to continue advocating for respect and awareness in their own communities. The event honoring Mrs. Peterson not only celebrated her efforts, but also brought the veteran community closer together. Old friendships were rekindled, and new connections were made as veterans and supporters shared stories of service and discussed ways to continue promoting respect for those who had served. The sense of unity was palpable, and the gathering left everyone feeling more determined than ever to stand up for veterans' rights and dignity. After the event, Mrs. Peterson felt a renewed sense of purpose. She realized that her experience with Daniel had sparked something much bigger, a movement to ensure that veterans were respected and appreciated everywhere. The collective effort of the veteran community and the support from the public reinforced her belief in the power of standing up for what was right. In the days following the event, Mrs. Peterson took time to reflect on Daniel's public apology. She recognized that his remorse seemed genuine, and she wondered if there might be an opportunity for a meaningful conversation between them. After some consideration, she decided that she would be open to meeting him face to face, provided he truly wanted to make amends. To her surprise, Daniel reached out, requesting a private meeting to apologize in person. He expressed a sincere desire to understand the impact of his actions and to make things right. Initially hesitant, Mrs. Peterson appreciated his effort and agreed to meet. They arranged to meet at a local cafe, where they could have a conversation in a calm and neutral setting. When the day of the meeting arrived, Mrs. Peterson and Daniel sat down across from each other. Daniel was visibly nervous, but he spoke with humility, expressing his deep regret for how he had treated her on the flight. He admitted that his actions had been thoughtless and rude, and he wanted to apologize face to face. Mrs. Peterson listened quietly, giving him the chance to speak his piece. In response, Mrs. Peterson shared how his actions had affected her, both as an elderly woman and as a veteran. She spoke about the respect that veterans deserve and how his behavior had been hurtful. As she spoke, Daniel listened intently, realizing the gravity of his mistake. As Mrs. Peterson shared her feelings, Daniel's remorse deepened. He apologized again, this time with more understanding of the hurt he had caused. He acknowledged that he hadn't considered her service or the dignity she carried, and admitted that he had acted out of entitlement and impatience. Mrs. Peterson appreciated his honesty and the humility he was showing, recognizing that he was genuinely trying to make amends. Their conversation then shifted to broader topics about respect and community. Mrs. Peterson emphasized the importance of treating people, especially veterans, with empathy and gratitude. She spoke about her time in the Navy and the sacrifices that service members make, explaining how those experiences shape a person's need for recognition and respect. Daniel nodded, absorbing her words with a newfound respect for what veterans endure. As they continued talking, they found common ground in wanting to foster a better sense of community and understanding. Daniel even suggested volunteering at veteran organizations as a way to show his commitment to change. He expressed his desire to do something meaningful to honor veterans and make up for his previous behavior. Mrs. Peterson welcomed this suggestion and offered to connect him with some local groups where he could start. By the end of the conversation, there was a sense of reconciliation. Daniel, having listened and learned, expressed his commitment to becoming a more considerate and respectful person. Mrs. Peterson, while still holding firm on the importance of respect, accepted his apology and saw potential in his willingness to change. They parted ways with a handshake, a shared understanding, and mutual respect. After the meeting, Mrs. Peterson felt a sense of closure that she hadn't expected, knowing that her experience had not only sparked public conversation, but had also led Daniel to reflect and change his ways, brought her a sense of peace. She returned to her work with veteran organizations, feeling reassured that her message was reaching people and making a difference. Daniel, on the other hand, followed through on his promise. He began volunteering with local veteran groups, offering his time and resources to help veterans in his community. He made a conscious effort to educate himself about the experiences of veterans and to spread the message of respect and gratitude. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's actions spoke louder than his initial apology. He became an active volunteer with local veteran organizations, spending time with veterans, listening to their stories, and helping with events and fundraisers. His efforts did not go unnoticed, and many veterans appreciated his dedication to making amends. Slowly but surely, Daniel earned the respect of those around him, not through words, but through his consistent actions. Meanwhile, Mrs. Peterson continued to advocate for veterans, both locally and nationally. She gave talks, participated in events, and collaborated with various organizations to ensure that veterans received the respect and recognition they deserved. The momentum from her initial experience with Daniel had grown into a larger movement that was making an impact across communities. Veterans everywhere were sharing their stories, and the conversation around respect for service members had gained national attention. One day, at a veteran appreciation event, Daniel and Mrs. Peterson crossed paths again. This time, the atmosphere was different. Daniel had earned a place within the veteran community through his genuine efforts, and he approached Mrs. Peterson with a warm smile. They exchanged pleasantries, and Mrs. Peterson acknowledged the progress he had made. "You've done well," she said kindly, and Daniel thanked her, humbled by her words. At the event, Daniel gave a speech sharing his journey of growth and the lessons he had learned from his encounter with Mrs. Peterson. He spoke about the importance of humility, respect, and the need to honor those who had served their country. His speech was well received, and many veterans in attendance appreciated his honesty and commitment to positive change. For Mrs. Peterson, seeing Daniel's transformation was a reminder of the power of communication, empathy, and second chances. Her experience had sparked a ripple effect, influencing not only Daniel, but also the many people who had followed the story. It showed her that even the most difficult encounters could lead to something positive if approached with patience and understanding. As the event concluded, Mrs. Peterson reflected on how far things had come since that fateful flight. What had started as a moment of rudeness had turned into an opportunity for growth, awareness, and community action. The veteran community had come together, Daniel had found a path toward redemption, and Mrs. Peterson had helped spark a larger conversation about respect for veterans. In the end, Mrs. Peterson knew that the impact of her story would continue to resonate. The journey had reminded her, and those around her, that respect, understanding, and kindness are values worth fighting for, and that even small acts can lead to meaningful change. With that thought, she left the event with a sense of fulfillment, knowing that she had made a difference not only for herself, but for veterans everywhere.